Well, in this series, I'm going to explain how touchscreens work. Well, Johnson was the first to create touchscreen technology. These displays hadn't gained much popularity till the 1970s, but when the first resistive touchscreen was accidentally invented, further developing on that new technology, scientists at the University of Toronto invented the first multi-touch display in the 1980s. This technology used an electrostatic paper, which takes signals for granted. In the 80s, they used a type of technology which came a little bit later, which I'll tell a little bit later. As for the very first touchscreen cell phones, they came a little bit later, around the 1980s, 1990s. So yes, this was one of the phones, well, the 1990s phones, or for example, one of the first phones ever. This phone on the left is a Simone phone made in 1992. This phone was, well, let's just say the world's first phone. It was invented in 1992, 25 years ago, created by IBM. The Simone personal communicator was truly a revolution. But the problem was, it didn't exactly use touchscreen. It was more like you had to use a stylus, or a stylus pen. And it wasn't exactly the size. It was a big, hefty 7 pounds in your pocket, which I don't think is very, let's just say, easy to carry, because it's very heavy. And let me tell you this, you couldn't do anything. The only thing you could do is, well, there were only a few apps. For example, there was only, you could only talk, you could only see the time, you had a calendar, you had the address book, you had, well, let's just say a password, you had Scrabble, which was basically a mini game. So basically, it was basically like a middle mini computer in your pocket. It was basically not really even a smartphone. It was basically a mini computer, since it was so heavy. So it couldn't really communicate with others. You cannot take you there was no you couldn't call others, but you could do the mail. There was mail. And then it was easily hackable, but most of it later. It was, well, truly a revolution. It was the first phone to combine the function of a cell phone. You could you could make calls, correction. But the problem was that there was lots of static and you couldn't really hear the other person because the signal was very weak. It would be more like a fuzzy mess than an actual communication. That was why many people still used the normal telephones, like at the telephone box or the normal home communication telephones they had in their home that back then. Since these handheld technologies, or these what they call the personal communicator, had such a static technology, it was so static that you couldn't even hear their voice, leading to, well, you couldn't even hear anything. So basically, that was the problem. It was also a PDA, which was back then a handheld device. And what they call a PDA is basically a device where you could make emails and send faxes. And faxes was basically the olden days internet. You could send photos to others, except they didn't have screens back then. Well, they did have TVs, but they weren't connected to the internet, and the internet wasn't really even invented yet. So these faxes were sent by signals, and the image you received was printed out by a fax machine, which is basically an advanced printer. That was basically it. On the right, we have one of the revolutionary technologies. It was the Nokia 3310. And it was truly a revolution. It was noted as the unbreakable phone. It was it was really unbreakable, because if you see in YouTube videos, people have dropped it from 100, even 1,000 feet from like a helicopter, but it doesn't break. Well, in a sense, what I mean by it doesn't break, it still functions. That's what I mean. It was a GSM mobile phone, which was announced on the 1st of September 2000. It was, well, a mobile phone, which was, it had internet access, It had text messaging, digital photography, video games, which video games weren't really video games. They were mostly worse than the dinosaur game. Let's just say that. They were basically a type of telephony. In other words, basically a tiny computer, except it had the processing power of, well, half of a computer. That's basically a computer. Well, it had really bad processing power. But now you're going to ask me, hey, wasn't the world's first Siemens phone better than this one, since there was a touchscreen display and this one doesn't? Well, the thing was, if you take it in comparison, the Siemens phone was more like a portable computer because it was 7 pounds, and this one here on the right was around just 1 pound, 2 pounds, around there. That was made in consideration too. And yes, at this time in the 2000s, there wasn't as much static in your voice, and the phone on the right, the Nokia, had better signals, since the internet and all these things have more better evolved. Putting all this into consideration was truly revolutionary, and besides, the Siemens phone wasn't really popular at that time. Since they didn't really market the phone, and well, they thought that this wasn't the future. They thought more of this was the future on the right with buttons, since they thought, or at least in the people with the mindset on the 90s had the mindset that the phones with buttons were more compact and easier, since fiddling with a touchscreen was harder than just pressing a few buttons and making a call. So yes, this was released in the fourth quarter of the year, replacing the popular Nokia 3210. The thing was, well, it had a better processor, the 3310, and was basically unbreakable. And just look at this. It had a processor which was not very good, but very good at that time. So how does this technology work, or the Siemens PDA? There is a conductive material on the right. This is, when pushed, is a resistive current. And basically, in other words, if you know how ATMs work, or at least the cheap ATMs in a sense, or the old ones, you usually have to push really hard to have it register your touch. That was basically it. They use these as really cheap devices, since they're really cheap to make, since they didn't use really fancy capacitors, which at that time was really expensive. Capacitors at that time were expensive and hard to manufacture, and well, they weren't just really practical. Since they're really, really big, and you can't just put them in a smartphone. And they weren't really invented yet. So basically, let's just say in other words, the conductive material is a magnet, is the North Pole, and the resistive is the South Pole. And the thing is that there are these little balls which resist it from touching each other. But with given enough force, you can make the conductive material, or the magnet in a sense, touch the South Pole. But the thing in this, it's a different type of magnet. This, let's just say it's a flexible magnet. And if you see two magnets with each other, and let's say you put like a block in the middle, they won't be able to touch because those balls are keeping it in the way. But if you give enough force, when the conductive, or the South Pole, comes in the right position with the North Pole, it will attach, which would make it, register current. In this place, this is an electromagnetic. Well, in this place, that's not the case here. It's just an example. The magnet, on the other hand, wasn't exactly, a magnet. It was more like an electromagnetic field around this. So whenever you touch, an electromagnetic field is displayed, which I'll be saying here. This is what these types of cheap technologies were used. If you've seen one of these, at least when I was in 2010s to 2005s, we had GPSs, since we did have Google Maps, but they weren't really good in a sense, since GPSs were more popular and people just liked them better for some reason, since it was a better, bigger display, and it had it was just popular. That's the problem. That's the thing. Kind of like how Tommy Hilfiger is so if people still buy it, since it's known as an expensive brand. That's basically it. Since because of its popularity, even though phones with Google Maps came out, people didn't want to buy. We didn't want to use them as their GPS devices. And also since the GPSs were really cheap, that was another reason. On the next thing is that we have phones like this. This is a Motorola Razr, and these use the next gen technologies. The Motorola Razr was a small color external screen and guess what? It had a camera. And as a matter of fact, in just 4 years, this had, don't get me wrong, a color display, with a multi-touch display, which came in 2005, and it sold 130 million of these. And also, since it was pretty cheap, that was another reason. And we have but until then, phones were most people liked phones since they had the reason why most people didn't want to make touchscreen phones was, first of all, they weren't popular, and people, as I said before, they thought that buttons were way easier than just fiddling with the display. Since how does just clicking 2 buttons is better than, touching your phone 5 times, going into the app, pressing the home button, searching up your person you want to dial. And people just felt like this on the left with buttons was more easier. But Steve Jobs and his crew came in and just revolutionized everything. This was the iPhone with the first real multi-touch display, and could register up to five prints. Not just one, but 5. These use a different type of technologies. And also, it was a very revolutionary one, since it had was about 4 years ahead of its competitors. So it took up to 4 years for everyone else to catch up with the iPhone. So yes, this has, the iPhone, on the other hand, works like this. There are basically 4 lines. And to make the screen work, both of these layers, all these layers, are thinly coated with some sort of magnetic compound that conducts electricity, like indium tin oxide. This changes the voltage, and a small processor connected to the screen can calculate exactly where you press in X and Y coordinates. How does this make this work? Where's the electricity coming from? This is where it comes from. The human body has a natural capacitance, which means our body can conduct electric current and can store electric charge. And if you didn't know, electricity doesn't actually flow through your finger. But actually, the electrostatic field feels the effects of your electric charge and redistributes itself accordingly. What this means is, like I said, your finger has a field, or electromagnetic field. And what the thing is about these types of phones is that you don't have to push hard, really, really hard. If you didn't know, you don't even have to touch your touchscreen phone. You don't have to even touch your phone to make it work or touch something. If your finger is so close to the touchscreen display, or if your finger is really big, you don't really have to even touch the phone. If your finger is really big, you don't have to even touch the phone, since it has a big electromagnetic signal around it, or also known as an electrostatic field. So, yes, you don't have to even touch it. You just have to get really close, and that's how touchscreens work. That's basically how it works. And also, there are these many points. They're not exactly this much. There's millions and trillions of these little points. Not trillions, but millions of these little points. And millions of these lines. And every time you go near one of those lines, these lines capture the field and they distribute. That's it. So what are the layers of the glass? There's chemically toughened glass. This uses, it's basically chemically toughened glass, which is the next part. Basically, in simple terms, there's basically these really big, well, let's just say, okay, let's take an example. Let's just say you're on a train, okay? And there are all these people. There's lots of big people and there's lots of small people. And if you're one of the smaller ones, you're probably the ones who are gonna get squished by all the big people or the bigger ones. While the bigger ones aren't really gonna be squished from the smaller ones, since they're the ones who are squishing the others because they're so big. That's the same that works here. The smaller ones are getting cramped by the bigger ones, or the bigger protons slash electrons. Not electrons, but bigger things. I don't know what this is, but it's the bigger ones. And when it gets crushed, these get cramped, which causes it to expand. And well, it doesn't really cause it to expand, just that's how it works. Since it's compressing the smaller people, like I said, you're getting cramped. This is the same what works here, and this causes heat to generate. And when heat generates, they kind of infuse together, as shown here. Well, this is how the latest smartphones work. There's this. Let's just take a deep into how they work. There's this thing called indium tin oxide. So how this works is, let's say you have fingers, okay? This is basically how it works. This is how the magnetism works. When you go close to one of those capacitors, it feels the electrostatic charge and it reacts to it, and then it goes into the processor and it processes where it exactly is, the x and y coordinates exactly, and then processes them to where they were, making your screen slightly show up to where they were. And well, this is just an example. Normal glass is 70, tempered glass is 210, and chemically strengthened glass is up to 5 times stronger than normal glass. But nowadays we just have tempered glass. Normal glass is like it's a type of glass they used in like 1940s cars. Like if you just, it breaks. Tempered glass, if it doesn't really break and shatter, it just cracks into pieces, big pieces. And chemically strengthened glass, it doesn't really even break and fall down. It just gets shattered. You can't really break it. And this is how it works. When you store all those, well, let's just say in the other example, when you store all those things into 400 potassium, it's called potassium nitrate 400C. That's what the scientists call. And this is the summary. This is a summary of how it was invented. So yes, just take a look and thank you for listening.